There was a period in my life, maybe 4 or 5 years after I started living alone, where I genuinely couldn't tell the difference between resting and retreating. I'd come home from whatever the day had asked of me, close the door behind me, and feel this immediate relief, like pressure releasing from a valve. And I told myself that was a good sign, that I was someone who knew what he needed, that the quiet was doing something for me. And sometimes it was. But sometimes, and it took me a long time to see this honestly, I wasn't resting at all. I was hiding. I was closing the door not because I needed to recover, but because the world outside had started to feel like too much work. The phone I wasn't answering, the invitation I was letting expire, the conversation I kept meaning to have and kept not having, and the quiet covered all of it. It felt exactly the same from the inside. That's the thing nobody tells you about solitude. It can be two completely different things, and they feel almost identical until you look very closely. So tonight, I want to look closely, not to tell you that you're doing it wrong, but because I think there's a question buried in the title of this video that a lot of people are quietly carrying, and I think it deserves a real answer. Stay with me. Let me start with what solitude actually does when it's working, because I don't want to spend this whole conversation in the shadow. There is something genuinely restorative about chosen quiet, and I think that's worth naming clearly before we get to the harder part. When you step away from the noise of other people, the demands, the performances, the social math of every room you walk into, something in you gets to stop working, not in a lazy way, in the way a muscle stops working when you finally put the weight down. There's a release and then a kind of slow filling back up. Some people describe this as attention restoration, the idea that the mind has a limited capacity for directed focus, and that certain kinds of quiet allow it to recover. I think most people who value solitude have felt this without needing a name for it. You go in depleted. You come out more like yourself. That's solitude doing its job. And beyond the recovery, there's something else. When you're not constantly responding to other people, their moods, their needs, their expectations, you get access to your own interior in a way that's very hard to find otherwise. Your actual preferences, your actual feelings underneath the feelings you perform for the room, your actual thoughts, not the ones you're curating for someone else's comfort. That clarity is real. And for people who are naturally more interior, people who think deeply, feel carefully, process slowly, solitude isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. It's how they stay calibrated. If that sounds like you, I want you to hold on to that, because what I'm about to say next isn't an argument against solitude. It's a distinction inside it. Here's what I've noticed about the other kind. The solitude that isn't restoring you tends to have a particular quality. It's quieter on the surface and louder underneath. You close the door, and instead of feeling the pressure release, you feel something else, a kind of low hum. Your mind doesn't settle, it circles. The same thought about the same person, the same unresolved conversation, the same thing you said 3 weeks ago that you can't stop replaying. Psychologists draw a distinction between reflection and rumination. Reflection moves. It takes something uncomfortable and turns it over, looks at it from different angles, and tends toward some kind of resolution, even a partial one. Rumination loops. It revisits the same material repeatedly without getting anywhere. And the feeling of being alone with rumination is profoundly different from the feeling of being alone with genuine reflection. But both happen in the same quiet room, and from the outside, they can look identical. When the solitude is hiding you, the alone time doesn't end with you feeling more like yourself. It ends with you feeling more stuck, more tired, more confirmed in whatever you were afraid of before you walked in. And here's the part worth sitting with. If you've been spending a lot of time alone lately, and you keep coming out of it feeling the same or worse, not occasionally, but as a pattern, that's information. Not a diagnosis, not a verdict on who you are, just information worth taking seriously. I want to talk about something specific now, because I think one of the clearest signals, for me personally, and I suspect for others, is what you're doing with the people in your life while you're alone. There was a man I'll call Richard. We'd been friends for a long time, the kind of friendship that had survived job changes and moves, and the quiet erosions that life puts on most relationships. We didn't talk every week, but when we did, it felt easy. The way good friendships do when they've been through enough together. And then, somewhere in my mid-50s, I stopped calling. Not dramatically, not because of a fight or a falling out. I just kept putting it off. I'd think about him on a Tuesday, tell myself I'd call on the weekend, and then the weekend would come, and I'd be in the quiet, and it would feel like not the right moment. Too much time had passed. The call would require explaining the gap, and explaining the gap required more than I had. So I'd wait another week, and then another. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd reach out when I had more to give, that Richard would understand. What I didn't admit to myself, what I couldn't see clearly until much later, was that I wasn't waiting until I had more to give. I was waiting until the act of giving felt safe again. And that day kept not coming, because I never did anything to make it come. 2 years passed. Not because either of us was angry, not because the friendship had failed, because I had let the quiet swallow it whole, one postponed Tuesday at a time. That's not rest. That's a particular kind of avoidance that borrows the aesthetic of peace while doing the opposite of what peace does. And I think some of you know exactly what I'm describing, not because you lost a Richard, but because you have someone like him, someone you keep meaning to reach out to, someone the gap has grown with, quietly, while you were in the quiet. Healthy solitude tends to make you more available to the people who matter to you, not less. You come out of the quiet refreshed enough to actually show up. You want to reach out. You look forward to it. The alone time charged you. And now you want to spend some of that charge on someone you love. When the solitude is hiding you, the opposite tends to happen. The longer you're in it, the further away people feel. And the further they feel, the harder it becomes to close the gap. Until one day, you look up and realize the gap has become its own kind of life. I looked up one day and Richard was gone. Not dead. Just gone from my life in every practical sense. And I was the one who had let that happen, one quiet evening at a time, while telling myself I was resting. That cost me something real. I want you to know that. Not so you feel bad about your own quiet, but so you understand that the stakes here are not abstract. The people who drift away during our hiding seasons rarely drift back, and we often don't notice the loss until it's already complete. So how do you actually tell the difference from the inside? I've thought about this a lot, and I don't think there's a clean test, but I've found a few questions that tend to cut through the noise if you let them land. The first one is this: when you come out of your alone time, do you feel more like yourself, or do you feel the same as when you went in? Sit with that for a moment, because it's a more specific question than it first sounds. Solitude that's doing something for you tends to have a direction. You went in tired or scattered or overwhelmed, and you came out with more ground under your feet, not transformed, not fixed, just a little more settled, a little more yourself. That's the recovery working. But if you're honest, and I want you to be honest here because this is just you and me, if you're coming out of your alone time feeling essentially the same as you went in, or worse, then something else is happening in that room. And it's worth asking, what? The second question is harder. Are you alone because you want to be, or because you've stopped believing the alternative is worth it? I sat with that one for a long time. Because on certain evenings, in certain seasons of my life, the honest answer was the second one. I wasn't in the quiet because the quiet was feeding me. I was in the quiet because the world outside had started to feel like a problem I had quietly decided not to solve. Not consciously, not as a choice I made out loud, but in the accumulated weight of all the evenings I stayed in when I could have reached out, all the calls I didn't make, all the doors I closed while telling myself I was resting. If that resonates, even a little, I don't want you to hear it as an accusation. I want you to hear it as a recognition. Because the first step out of hiding is usually just seeing that you're in it. The third question is the gentlest one, and maybe the most useful. If you reached out to someone today, just one person, just a short message, would it feel like relief or would it feel like work? Notice what your body does with that question before your mind gets to it. Because the body usually knows before the mind admits it. If the idea of reaching out to someone you care about feels like relief, like something you actually want, that's a sign the solitude has been doing its job. You've rested enough to want connection again. That's the system working the way it should. If it feels like work, heavy, effortful, like a task you'd rather leave for another day, that's the signal worth paying attention to. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something in you may have learned, somewhere along the way, that connection costs more than it gives. And that belief, left unexamined in the quiet, tends to deepen. I'm not asking you to answer these out loud, but I think they're worth keeping somewhere close. Here's where I want to land. Solitude is not the problem. I want to say that plainly. The quiet is not what's hurting you. The quiet is neutral. It will hold whatever you bring into it. The question is always what you're bringing. And for people who need solitude, genuinely need it, the way some people need sleep or open air, this kind of honesty isn't a reason to give up the quiet. It's a reason to be more intentional about it. There's a version of being alone that is one of the most honest, generative, clarifying things a human being can do with their time. And there's a version that is a long, quiet conversation with your own fear, dressed up as peace. The difference isn't always visible from the outside. Most of the time it isn't. But you know, somewhere underneath the routine and the closed door and the comfortable evening, you know. And I think most people who are asking themselves the question in this video's title already have a sense of which one they're living in right now. The question was never whether you're allowed to be alone. Of course you are. The question is whether the alone is working for you, or whether you've been working for it. That's the one worth sitting with. I'll leave you with this. Healing solitude makes you quieter on the outside and clearer on the inside. Hiding solitude makes you quieter on the outside and louder on the inside. You'll know which one you're in by what you hear when the room goes still. Tell me in the comments, do you feel like your solitude is healing you right now, or does some part of you recognize the other thing? I read everything, and I'd genuinely like to know. I'm Daniel. I'll see you next time.